I'm Emily, 32 female. I live alone in a city apartment that's modest but mine, a quiet sanctuary from the noise of my job as a senior data scientist. My life is a carefully constructed world of numbers and patterns, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotional landscape of my family. For years, I believed that my success was a way to repay them for their love, but a single dinner revealed it was only ever seen as a resource to be drained. This is the story of how I paid the ultimate price for their comfort, and then took back everything they took for granted. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The air in my parents' dining room was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and simmering resentment. It was our monthly family dinner, a tradition that had started as a way to stay connected, but had slowly morphed into a tribunal where my life choices were dissected and judged. I sat at the familiar oak table, a relic from my childhood, feeling the polished wood smooth beneath my fingertips. Opposite me, my younger sister, Juliet, was practically vibrating with excitement, her hand resting possessively on her fiancé Martin's arm. My mother, Jennifer, brought the platter of chicken to the table, her movements efficient and practiced. She placed it in the center with a thud. "There we are," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Plenty for everyone." My father, Archie, grunted his approval from the head of the table, already eyeing the crispiest piece of skin. He was a man of few words, but his silence was often more damning than any reprimand. He had a way of observing, his gaze heavy with unspoken expectations. "So, Juliet began, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Martin and I have finally set a date." I forced a smile. "That's wonderful news, Juliet. Congratulations to you both." Martin, a personal trainer whose biceps seemed to be his primary personality trait, gave me a smug grin. "Thanks, Emily. We're thinking of a spring wedding. April." "It's all very exciting," my mother interjected, passing me the bowl of mashed potatoes. "Of course, a wedding is a huge expense. We've been running the numbers, and it's a lot." She sighed dramatically, her eyes flicking from me to my father, a silent, well-rehearsed exchange. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I knew where this was going. It was a path we had walked many times before. My promotion, my bonus, my decision to buy a new car, every financial step forward I took was seen as a collective family achievement, a fund to be tapped. "Weddings are expensive," I agreed cautiously, spooning a small portion of potatoes onto my plate. I wasn't hungry anymore. Juliet leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Exactly. And since I'm not really working right now, the influencer thing is taking a while to get off the ground. We were thinking," she trailed off, looking at our mother for backup. Mom cleared her throat and pointed her fork at me as if it were a scepter. "You're the only one with a good job, Emily, a real career. You should pay for your sister's wedding." The statement hung in the air, blunt and heavy. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. My father, who had been methodically carving the chicken, paused and nodded his agreement. "It's the least you can do after everything we've done for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "All those years we supported you through university." I looked from my mother's expectant face to my father's stony expression. They had supported me, it was true. They had paid for my tuition, a fact they never let me forget. It was a debt I had been repaying, in one form or another, for my entire adult life. Juliet smirked, a triumphant, cutting expression that I knew all too well. "Yeah, you owe us," she added, her tone light and breezy, as if she were talking about a $5 loan. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, the cool glass a small anchor in the storm of indignation rising within me. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of years of quiet sacrifices, of paying for her car repairs, her rent, her endless stream of emergency expenses. I thought of the countless times I had put my own needs aside to help them, to be the responsible one. And then a thought, sharp and clear, cut through the anger. It was a secret I had been holding on to, a grand gesture I had been planning for months. It was meant to be a surprise, a gift of pure love and gratitude. Now, in the face of their entitlement, it felt like a sick joke. I calmly put my glass down on the table, the small click echoing in the sudden silence. I met their gazes, one by one. My mother defiant, my father resolute, my sister smug. "Funny," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "Because I just paid off your entire mortgage and was planning to surprise you with the deed at Christmas." The change in the room was instantaneous. The smugness on Juliet's face evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Martin's jaw went slack. My mother's fork clattered onto her plate, and my father's hand, holding the carving knife, froze midair. "You what?" my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "I paid off the house," I repeated, letting the words sink in. All of it. The final payment went through last week. I was going to frame the paid-in-full notice and give it to you as a Christmas present, a way to say thank you for everything. Silence. The aroma of the roast chickens suddenly seemed cloying, sickening. My father found his voice first. It was hoarse. "The whole mortgage." "Every last cent," I confirmed. "I've been saving for years, putting aside a portion of every paycheck. I wanted you to be able to retire without that debt hanging over you." Juliet stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The dream of her lavish wedding, funded by me, was crumbling before her eyes. "But the wedding," she stammered. I looked directly at her, and for the first time, I didn't try to soften my words or manage her feelings. "The wedding is your responsibility, Juliet, not mine." My mother started to rally, a flush of anger rising in her cheeks. "But you just said you have the money. You paid off a house. You can afford to give your sister the wedding she deserves." "What she deserves?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "What I deserve is a family that sees me as a daughter, not a bank. For years I have helped, I have given. But this demand, this assumption that my success belongs to you, that I owe you a wedding, that's a step too far." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The family dinner was over. "The house is paid for. It's in your name, free and clear. That was my final gift to you, my final repayment of a debt you never let me forget." I paused at the door, turning back to face their stunned, greedy faces. "Then I told them what I'm doing with the house next," I said, letting the words hang in the air, a promise and a threat. "Since you feel I owe you so much, I've decided to put a lien on the property, for the full amount I paid. You can pay me back when you sell it to fund Juliet's wedding." The lie was audacious, probably not even legally possible, but they didn't know that. The shock on their faces was everything. I had paid off their home out of love, and they had met that love with greed. Now they would understand the consequences of their entitlement. I walked out of the house, the home I had just secured for them, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free of it. The debt was finally, unequivocally, paid, and a new one had just been created. Walking away from that dinner felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't even realized I was in. The cool night air hit my face, a welcome shock to my system. As I drove back to my apartment, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red, mirroring the chaotic swirl of emotions inside me. Anger, yes, but also a profound, aching sadness. The grand gesture, the one I had poured so much of myself into, had been twisted into something ugly and transactional before I even had the chance to present it. My relationship with my family, I realized, had always been transactional. I was the investment. From a young age, I was the one who was good at school, the one with the potential to make something of herself. My parents, Jennifer and Archie, had come from humble backgrounds. They worked hard, blue-collar jobs their entire lives, and they saw in me a chance for a different kind of life, a life of financial security they'd never had. Their support during my university years was real. They took on extra shifts, lived frugally, and never complained about the cost of my textbooks or tuition. I was deeply grateful, and I worked tirelessly to make them proud. I graduated at the top of my class, landed a prestigious internship, and quickly climbed the corporate ladder in the competitive field of data science. Juliet, however, was a different story. She was the pretty one, the charmer. While I was buried in books, she was out with friends, effortlessly popular. School was never her priority. She scraped by with average grades and had no real ambition beyond finding a husband who could provide for her. Our parents rarely pushed her. They celebrated her C's as if they were A's and praised her social skills as her greatest asset. "Not everyone is book smart like you, Emily," my mother would say, ruffling Juliet's hair. "Juliet has her own gifts." Her gifts, it turned out, were an uncanny ability to create financial crises that only I could solve. It started small. A phone bill she couldn't pay, a late fee on her rent. I'd cover it, of course. She was my sister. But the requests grew in scale and frequency. And her old car broke down. I co-signed the loan for a new one. A loan I ended up paying off myself when she lost her job as a receptionist for being too distracted by social media. She drifted from one part-time gig to another, never holding a position for more than a few months. Her latest venture was becoming a social media influencer, which seemed to involve taking endless selfies and writing captions full of grammatical errors. It generated zero income, but it gave her an excuse to avoid real work. All the while, our parents enabled her. They'd call me, their voices laced with worry. "Juliet is struggling, Emily. She just needs a little help to get on her feet." My help was a constant stream of money flowing from my bank account to hers. I paid for her groceries, her clothes, her weekend trips with friends. I did it because I loved them and because I felt a heavy sense of obligation. I was living the comfortable life they had sacrificed for, so it only seemed fair to share the fruits of my labor. The idea to pay off their mortgage had come to me 2 years earlier. My father had been forced into early retirement after a workplace injury, and my mother had stopped working to take care of him. Their savings were meager, and the monthly mortgage payment was a constant source of stress for them. I saw a way to give them the ultimate gift: peace of mind. A home that was truly theirs, a place where they could live out their retirement without financial fear. So I started saving, aggressively. I cut back on my own spending, passed on vacations, and funneled every spare dollar into a high-yield savings account I labeled the Freedom Fund. It became my mission, a secret project that filled me with a sense of purpose. I imagined the looks on their faces when I told them. I pictured my mother crying tears of joy, my stoic father embracing me with pride. It would be the moment I finally, truly, repaid my debt. Now that dream was shattered. Their reaction at dinner laid the truth bare. They didn't see my success as my own, they saw it as a family resource they were entitled to manage. My accomplishments were not a source of pride, but a measure of my ability to provide for them. Paying off the mortgage wasn't enough. It was simply a prerequisite for the next, even bigger demand: a lavish wedding for the sister who had never worked a day for it. The smirk on Juliet's face when she said, "Yeah, you owe us," was the final, brutal cut. There was no gratitude, no appreciation for the years I had supported her, just the cold, hard certainty that it was her due. She was the princess, and I was the workhorse meant to fund her fairy tale. As I pulled into my parking garage, I shut off the engine and let the silence of the car envelop me. The lie I'd told them about putting a lien on the house was a desperate, angry outburst. But as I sat there, a new feeling began to take root beneath the anger: resolve. They had shown me who they truly were. They had taken my greatest act of love and thrown it back in my face, their hands outstretched for more. They believed I owed them. Fine, I would show them what it really meant to settle a debt. The Freedom Fund was intended to give them freedom. Now, it would be used to buy my own. I had the paperwork for the paid-off mortgage in a folder in my apartment, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment had passed, and a new one was on the horizon. My grand gesture wasn't going to be a framed notice on the wall. It was going to be an eviction notice on the door. The house was paid for, yes, but they were about to find out who the new owner was. My final payment was not the end of a debt, but the beginning of a reckoning. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the cost. I was ready to collect. The days following the disastrous dinner were filled with a deafening silence. No calls, no texts, not even an angry, guilt-tripping email from my mother. It was unnerving. My family's primary mode of communication was passive aggression, and this radio silence was the nuclear option. They were waiting for me to break, to come crawling back with an apology and an open checkbook. They had done this before, freezing me out until I relented on some smaller, past demand. But this time was different. I wasn't waiting for a thaw. I was planning for a controlled demolition. My first step was to confront the legal reality of my impulsive lie. I knew a lien was a complex legal tool, not something you could just slap on a property out of spite. I booked a consultation with a real estate lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright. I sat in her sleek, minimalist office, the folder containing all the mortgage payment documentation on my lap. I explained the situation, from the years of financial support to the final, outrageous demand for wedding funds. I told her how I had secretly paid off the entire mortgage on my parents' home, making direct payments to the bank over 2 years. Oh, the mortgage is fully paid, she asked, leaning forward with interest. Yes, the bank sent me the confirmation and the deed release documents last week. They are all in my possession. And whose name was on the original mortgage and deed? My parents, Archie and Jennifer, I replied. Ms. Albright steepled her fingers, her expression thoughtful. And you told them you were putting a lien on the house. I winced. It was a bluff. I was angry. She chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. I can imagine. Well, you're right, you can't retroactively place a lien on a property for what was essentially a series of gifts. There was no contract, no loan agreement. The law would see the money you paid as just that, a gift. My heart sank, so there's nothing I can do. I didn't say that, she said, a glint in her eye. You mentioned the bank sent you the deed release, and you've been making the payments directly. Have you spoken to your parents about the title transfer? No, I said slowly, my mind beginning to race. I was going to give them the paperwork at Christmas. I haven't even told them the bank has released the deed. Ms. Albright leaned back in her chair. Emily, when you pay off a mortgage, the bank releases its claim, and the title of the property must be officially transferred to the owner, free and clear. This is typically a straightforward process handled at the county recorder's office. Given that you have all the documentation and were the sole party interacting with the bank to pay off the loan, she paused for effect. It would be a very simple matter to have the new deed registered in your name instead of theirs. I stared at her, the audacity of the idea taking my breath away. Is that legal? You paid for the property, every last dollar of the remaining principal. You can argue that you were not gifting them the money, but purchasing the asset. It's an aggressive move, and they could certainly challenge it, but it would become a messy, protracted legal battle, one that would require them to prove you intended it as a gift, while you have the bank statements showing you paid for it. It would be your word against theirs. The secret burden I had carried for 2 years, the immense financial weight of their mortgage, was suddenly transformed. It was no longer a gift they had rejected. It was leverage. It was power. What would I need to do? I asked, my voice firm. You'll need to file a new deed, a quitclaim deed, transferring the property from them to you. Since you have the release from the bank, the county will see a clear path to the title. We would file it immediately. They wouldn't be notified until the transfer is officially recorded, which could take a few days. The plan was audacious, and a part of me recoiled from the cold, clinical nature of it. This was my family's home, the house I grew up in. But then I remembered my mother's pointing finger, my father's nod, Juliet's smirk. They saw the house as theirs, my money as theirs, my future as theirs to command. They had left me no room for sentimentality. I left Ms. Albright's office with a clear set of instructions and a feeling of cold, hard clarity. The emotional storm had passed, leaving a quiet, determined resolve in its wake. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about drawing a line so deep and so permanent that they could never cross it again. That evening, I went through my financial records, printing out every bank transfer to Juliet, every bill I had paid on her behalf, every withdrawal that corresponded to a frantic call from my parents. The numbers were staggering. It was far more than I had realized, a slow bleed over a decade that amounted to a small fortune. It was the price of my own car, a down payment on a larger apartment, a retirement fund I hadn't started. It was the physical proof of my sacrifice. As I compiled the documents, the silence from my family continued. I knew they were stewing, confident in their position. They believed my love and sense of duty would eventually outweigh my anger. They had always been able to guilt me into submission. They couldn't conceive of a world where I wouldn't yield. But they didn't know the secret I was carrying. They thought the battle was about a wedding. They had no idea it was about a house. They were waiting for me to fund a party while I was preparing to claim a kingdom. The deed release papers sat on my coffee table, a testament to my love and a tool for my liberation. The burden was no longer a secret. It was about to become their problem. The silence finally broke on a Thursday afternoon, a week after the dinner. It wasn't a call of apology or reconciliation. It was a text from Juliet. "Mom says you're not answering her calls. Are you seriously still sulking over that? We need to book the venue. It's going to be $20,000 for the deposit. I'll send you the details." I read the message twice, my thumb hovering over the screen. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was almost impressive. There was no please, no, can we talk about this, just a demand. "I'll send you the details," as if my role as her personal financier was a settled fact. I didn't reply. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was a masterclass in passive aggression. "Emily, darling, it's your mother. I'm just calling to see if you're all right. We're all very worried about you. This silence isn't healthy. Your sister is very upset. She thinks you're angry with her. Please call me back. We're family, after all." Family? The word felt like a weapon she was trying to use against me. The kind of family that saw one daughter as a cash machine and the other as a precious doll to be adorned. The next day, the pressure escalated. Martin, Juliet's fiancé, sent me a friend request on social media, which I ignored. Then came a message from him. "Hey, Emily, Juliet is really torn up about this. We all just want to move past it. She's your sister, and she deserves to be happy. This wedding means the world to her." He was the dutiful moo. Piece, parroting the family line. It was fascinating, in a horrifying way, to see how completely they had all bought into the narrative of my obligation. They had convinced themselves that their desires were my duties. Meanwhile, I was moving forward with Ms. Albright. I had signed the papers. The quitclaim deed had been filed with the county recorder's office. The transfer of ownership was in progress. It was a strange, out-of-body experience, signing a document that would effectively seize my childhood home. But every text, every voicemail, every piece of entitled communication from them solidified my resolve. They were proving my point for me, with every word. The tipping point came that weekend. I received a frantic call from my father. This time, I answered. I knew a call from him meant the situation had escalated. "Emily," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Your mother is in tears. Your sister won't come out of her room. What is wrong with you? We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us, by tearing this family apart over a little bit of money." "A little bit of money?" I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. $20,000 is not a little bit of money, Dad. A whole wedding is not a little bit of money. "It's nothing to you," he shot back. "You make more in a year than I made in 5. We didn't raise you to be selfish. We raised you to take care of your family." "I have been taking care of this family." My voice rose, the dam of my composure finally cracking. "I have been taking care of Juliet her entire adult life. I paid for her car, her rent, her bills. I paid off your house. I gave you a debt-free retirement, and your first thought was to demand more. Do you have any idea how that feels?" "It feels like you're doing your duty as a daughter," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You have, and Juliet has not. It's your responsibility to balance the scales." That was it. That was the core of their belief system, laid bare. It wasn't about love or gratitude. It was a cosmic balancing act, and I was on the hook for my sister's failures, for her lack of ambition, for her choices. My success wasn't mine. It was the family's way of offsetting Juliet's mediocrity. "The scales are balanced, Dad," I said, the fight draining out of me, replaced by an icy certainty. "You just don't know it yet." I hung up before he could respond. The next day, an email from Ms. Albright arrived in my inbox. The subject line was simple: confirmation. I opened it. The attached document was a copy of the newly recorded deed. There, in crisp, black letters, was the official record. The owner of 124 Maple Street was now Emily. Me. Holding the document, I felt a strange sense of peace. The anger had burned away, leaving behind a stark, clear landscape. They had shown me their ungrateful hearts, and in doing so, they had shown me the way forward. I thought about Juliet's text, about the $20,000 deposit. She wanted a venue. I was about to give her one. I drafted an email. My fingers flew across the keyboard. It was addressed to my mother, my father, and Juliet. Subject: important information regarding 124 Maple Street. Dear family, thank you for your recent communications regarding Juliet's wedding. It has become clear that we have a fundamental disagreement about my financial obligations. You are correct that I have a good job and have been financially successful. I have used that success to support this family for many years. My most recent act of support was, as you know, paying off the mortgage on the family home. However, your reaction to this gift, demanding that I then fund a lavish wedding, has forced me to reevaluate my position. Attached, you will find a copy of the newly recorded property deed for 124 Maple Street. As the party who satisfied the mortgage, I have taken legal ownership of the property. It is now mine. I am giving you 60 days notice to vacate the premises. You will need to find alternative living arrangements. I understand this will be a shock. However, you have made it clear that you see my assets as a resource to be used for Juliet's benefit. So, I have decided to liquidate this particular asset. Once the house is sold, I will be happy to give Juliet the $20,000 you requested for her wedding venue. The rest of the proceeds will be placed into a trust fund for my own future. Consider this my final contribution to the family. The scales are now balanced. Sincerely, Emily. I hit send. The ungrateful heart had made its final demand, and I had just given it its final answer. The house of cards they had built on the foundation of my guilt and obligation was about to come tumbling down. The email landed like a bomb. The ensuing explosion was everything I had expected and more. My phone started ringing almost immediately. First, my mother. Her name flashed on the screen and I watched it, my heart pounding a steady, resolute rhythm. I didn't answer. Then Juliet. T. Hen, my father. Then Martin. A barrage of calls, one after another, a digital siege. Then the texts started. They were a chaotic torrent of disbelief, rage, and panicked threats. From Mom: what is this? This is a joke, right? Emily calling me right now. This isn't funny. From Juliet: you can't do this. This is our home. You are a monster. I hate you. From Dad: you've gone too far. You'll regret this. From Martin: you need to fix this. You are destroying your family. I read them all, a strange detachment settling over me. Their words were just noise, the predictable death rattle of an entitlement that had been choked off at the source. They weren't angry that I was hurting them. They were angry that I was refusing to be used by them. I turned my phone on silent and put it in a drawer. The next 2 days were quiet. I knew they were scrambling, trying to understand what had happened. They would have called the bank, who would have confirmed the mortgage was paid. They might have even called a lawyer of their own, who would have delivered the grim news. Their legal standing was precarious at best. They lived in a house I owned, and I had just served them a formal notice to vacate. On the 3rd day, they showed up at my apartment. The buzz from the lobby was insistent. I looked at the security camera feed on my phone. My mother, father, and Juliet were crowded around the call box, their faces pale and strained. I pressed the button to speak. Yes. Emily, let us in. My mother's voice was thin, reedy. We need to talk. We are talking, I said calmly. Don't be ridiculous. Open the door, my father barked. No, I said simply. I have nothing more to say that wasn't in the email. You have 57 days left. You can't kick us out of our home, Juliet shrieked, her voice cracking. Where are we supposed to go? That is a problem you will have to solve as a family, I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. Perhaps Martin can help. I ended the call and watched them on the camera for a few more minutes. They stood there, looking lost and defeated. My mother was crying openly now, leaning on my father for support. Juliet was furiously typing on her phone, no doubt sending me another volley of hateful messages. A part of me, a small, deeply buried part, ached at the sight. But I knew this was a necessary surgery. The diseased limb had to be amputated to save the rest of the body. They finally left, and I was alone again in the quiet of my apartment. The finality of my actions began to sink in. This wasn't a temporary fight. This was a severing, a fundamental break that could never be repaired. I was evicting my own family. I was selling my childhood home. A week later, I received a letter from a lawyer they had retained. It was full of blustering legal threats, accusing me of fraud, elder abuse, and emotional distress. It demanded I immediately sign the house back over to them. I forwarded it to Ms. Albright. Her reply was swift and confident. Standard intimidation tactics. They have no case. We will respond accordingly. True to her word, she sent a reply that dismantled their lawyer's arguments one by one. She pointed out that I, and I alone, had made the payments that secured the property. She reiterated that my notice to vacate was perfectly legal. She concluded by stating that any further attempts at harassment would be met with a restraining order. After that, the legal threats ceased. The new strategy was emotional blackmail. I started getting calls from extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. The story they had been told was a masterpiece of manipulation. In their version, I was a cruel, vindictive daughter who, in a fit of selfish rage over a wedding, had stolen my parents' home out from under them. Your mother is devastated, one aunt told me, her voice thick with disapproval. She said she doesn't even know who you are anymore. Did she also tell you that I paid off their mortgage for them? I asked quietly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Well, she said you helped out. I didn't help out, I clarified. I paid the entire thing, over $100,000, as a gift they spat on before demanding another $20,000 for a party. Does that sound like the action of a loving family to you? The conversations all ended the same way, with confused silence. They had only been given one side of the story, the one where they were the victims and I was the villain. The truth was far more complicated, and it didn't fit neatly into their narrative of family loyalty. Throughout this period, I engaged a realtor and had the house officially listed for sale. It was priced to move, and given the market, we had an offer within 2 weeks. It was a good offer, well over the assessed value. I accepted it. The closing date was set for 45 days out, giving my family just 2 weeks to spare on their 60-day notice. The day the for sale sign went up in the front yard was the day they finally understood I was serious. The panicked calls started again, but this time the rage was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading tone. It was Juliet who called me, sobbing. Emily, please, don't do this. The sign is in the yard. People are looking at the house online. It's humiliating. You know what's humiliating, Juliet? I asked, my voice flat. Working for over a decade to build a life for yourself, only to have your family see you as nothing more than a walking ATM. That's humiliating. I'm sorry, she cried. Okay, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked for the money like that. We can have a smaller wedding. Just, please don't sell the house. It's too late for that, Juliet. The house is under contract. Then give the money to Mom and Dad, she pleaded. They can buy a smaller place, they have nowhere to go. I will be giving them a portion of the proceeds, I said. Enough for a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment. And, as promised, I will be giving you your $20,000. It was the final payment. A payment to end all payments. I was giving her exactly what she had demanded, but on my terms. I was giving her the money for her wedding, but at the cost of her family home. She would get her party, but she would lose her past. It was a brutal lesson in being careful what you wish for. There was a long silence on the line, filled only with the sound of her ragged breathing. She finally understood. There was no going back. I had paid the price for her wedding, a price far higher than she had ever imagined. The final 2 weeks before the closing date were the longest of my life. My family went from pleading to silent resignation. They hired movers. From a distance, through the realtor who was managing the property, I learned they had found a small 2-bedroom apartment to rent in a town about an hour away. It was all they could afford on their retirement income. I made a point of staying away from the house. I didn't want to see them packing up my childhood, turning memories into cardboard boxes. My realtor handled the final walkthroughs and inspections. She told me the house was being left in good condition, but that the atmosphere was unbearably sad. On the day of the closing, I sat in a sterile office with my realtor and Ms. Albright, signing a mountain of paperwork. When it was done, a check for the proceeds of the sale, a number with more zeros than I had ever seen in one place, was slid across the table to me. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the settlement for a wrongful death, the death of my family. True to my word, I went to my bank and had 2 cashier's checks drawn up. One was for Juliet in the amount of $20,000. The memo line read, "Wedding venue." The other was for my parents for $10,000. The memo line read, "New beginnings." I mailed the checks in a single envelope to their new address, sent via certified mail so I would know they received it. There was no letter, no note. The checks were the final words in our story. A week later, I received the signed receipt back in the mail. They had gotten the money. The transaction was complete. The real collapse, however, came from an unexpected quarter. Martin, the fiancé whose dream wedding had started this whole avalanche, had apparently not signed up for this level of drama. About a month after the move, I got a social media message from a mutual acquaintance. It was a screenshot of Juliet's latest post. It was a long, rambling tirade, full of vague accusations and self-pity. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest, it began. But the real news was buried in the comments. A friend had asked when the wedding was, and Juliet's reply was curt. "It's been postponed indefinitely." I did some digging. It turned out Martin had called off the engagement. The friend who sent me the screenshot filled in the details. He had told people that the stress of the Miley's situation was too much. He had seen a side of Juliet and her parents he didn't like, the grasping, entitled side I knew so well. When the dream of a grand, fully funded wedding evaporated, to be replaced by a cramped apartment and a bitter, resentful family, he had bylaid. The $20,000 check, it seemed, wasn't enough to keep him. The irony was almost too much to bear. In their quest to secure funding for a wedding, they had not only lost their home, but the wedding itself. Juliet's fairy tale had ended before it even began. The news about Martin gave me no pleasure. It was just another piece of wreckage in the blast zone I had created. The house of cards hadn't just collapsed, the wind had scattered the pieces to the 4 corners of the earth. I saw my mother once, a few months later. I was in a grocery store in a neighboring town and saw her in the produce aisle. She looked smaller, older. Her hair was grayer than I remembered. She was holding 2 apples, examining them with an intensity that spoke of a budget now carefully managed. Our eyes met for a brief second across a display of oranges. I saw a flicker of recognition, then a flash of pain, quickly masked by a stony glare. She turned and walked away without a word. I left my half-full cart in the aisle and walked out of the store, my hands shaking. The house was gone, the family was broken. Juliet's engagement was over. My final payment had cost them everything. And as I sat in my car in the parking lot, the silence was filled with the heavy, unavoidable question: what had it cost me? I had my freedom, my financial independence, my future secured and protected. But I was an orphan with living parents, a sister to a stranger. I had won the war, but I was the sole inhabitant of the kingdom I had fought for. The house of cards was gone, but I was left standing alone in the empty space where it used to be. Life after the explosion was quiet. The silence that had once been a weapon used against me was now just silence. The constant hum of family obligation that had been the background noise of my entire adult life was gone. In its place was a vast, empty space. At first, it was terrifying. I felt adrift, untethered from the identity I had always known, the responsible daughter, the supportive sister. I spent the first few months in a sort of self-imposed isolation. I worked, I came home, I ate, I slept. The money from the sale of the house sat in a high-yield savings account, untouched. It felt like blood money, and I didn't know what to do with it. The change began subtly. One Saturday, instead of my usual routine of errands and chores, I drove to the coast, a place I hadn't visited in years. I walked along the beach for hours, feeling the sand under my feet and the salt spray on my face. I watched the waves crash against the shore, a relentless, cleansing rhythm. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of peace. I realized that my entire life had been built on a faulty foundation, one made of guilt, obligation, and the desperate need for my family's approval. Now that foundation was gone, and I had the chance to build a new one, on my own terms. I started with small things. I redecorated my apartment, replacing the sensible, boring furniture I'd bought on sale with pieces that I truly loved. I started a new hobby, taking a pottery class on weeknights. The feeling of shaping a lump of clay into something new and whole felt deeply symbolic. I also sought out therapy. I needed a neutral party to help me unpack the years of emotional manipulation I had endured. My therapist helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of financial abuse, and that the grief I was feeling was real. It was okay to mourn the family I wished I had, while also accepting the reality of the family I did have. The biggest step was deciding what to do with the money. After much thought, I divided the proceeds from the sale into 3 parts. The first part I invested for my own retirement, finally putting myself first. The second part I used to create a scholarship fund at my alma mater for young women from low-income families pursuing careers in science and technology. I wanted to give someone else the chance I'd had, but without the invisible strings of familial debt. The third part was the hardest. I put a significant sum into a trust managed by a third-party financial firm. The beneficiaries were my parents. The trust was structured to provide them with a modest monthly stipend, enough to supplement their retirement income and ensure they would never be destitute. They would never know it came from me. The firm would manage all communication. It was an anonymous act of love, the only kind I could still give. It was a way to care for them without letting them back into my life, a way to fulfill what I saw as a true daughter's duty without sacrificing my own well-being. Juliet was not included. Her future was her own to build or to squander. One day, about a year after the closing, I received an email forwarded from Ms. Albright. It was from a lawyer representing my father. In the email, my father, through his lawyer, relinquished any and all future claims to my estate. It was a legal document, cold and formal, but the message was clear. It was his way of saying he understood. It was his white flag. It was, in its own stoic, Archie-like way, an apology. I never saw them again. I heard through the family grapevine that Juliet eventually got a job as a cashier and moved in with a roommate. My parents stayed in their small apartment. They were living a quiet, frugal life, the one they probably would have had if they hadn't tried to live a bigger one through me. My life, on the other hand, became bigger and brighter than I had ever imagined. Free from the weight of my family's expectations, I thrived. I traveled. I made new friends, people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. I even started dating someone, a kind man who celebrated my success without a hint of entitlement. My new foundation is built on self-respect, boundaries, and the quiet joy of a life lived authentically. The scar of my family is still there, a faint, silvery line on my heart. It reminds me of the price of freedom and the pain of letting go. But it no longer hurts. It's just a part of my story, a story not of revenge, but of reclamation. I didn't just sell a house. I bought back my life. And I am finally, truly, at home.